So I think we've just gone live.
Hi, and welcome to Massachusetts Women of Color Coalition and the League of Women Voters Facebook Live. Today's discussion topic is
Overcoming Betrayal and Exclusion, Building an Inclusive and Respectful Partnership. And this is part 3, Facing and Overcoming Challenges. I'm Patty Shepard,
and I'm Jean Morrison.
And off camera today we have
Jeanette Colace from the League of Women Voters in Winchester.
And we have a special guest just visiting and observing with us, but we want to acknowledge that she's in the room, and that is Maddie Ligon, who is retired from Winchester Public Schools as an assistant vice principal for the Winchester Middle School. And also she is a member of the League of Women Voters Cape Cod.
And last but certainly not least, we have in the room the VP for the Eastern Massachusetts Women of Color Coalition. Do you want to announce yourself?
Go ahead.
Chioma Nija? I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it. Anyway, we all know her by Chioma.
No, let's get it right. How do you pronounce yours?
Anaji.
Anaji. It's important to
It
get
is.
those things right.
I'm sorry. I'm definitely.
Okay, Patty, why don't you give us a little bit of background about what brings us here together? Some people have heard it before, but we'll be succinct and just catch people up that have not been familiar with the story.
So the thing that got us started in this is just about a year ago when I went to a League Leaders lunch in Massachusetts, and I was lucky enough to see Celia Blue, who was on a panel, DEI panel. And I was so inspired by her that I decided to approach her to see if she thought anybody in the Women's Massachusetts MAWOCC would want to partner with the League of Women Voters on any projects of any kind. So she put me in touch with Chioma, who's the Eastern VP, and we started having some phone calls, and those extended into more extensive phone calls of sort of talking with members of both the League and the local League in Winchester and the folks that were active in the eastern part of the state to sort of see how it would be to work together. And it was such a really powerful experience, we decided that we'd go with some Facebook Live events. So this is actually our 3rd event. We've done them every other month so far and are basically sharing our process with the rest of the folks that are watching the event. We've opened it to friends and members of both organizations as well as others.
Can you say a word or two about what the powerful experience was? Because I think something significant transpired between the two organizations that brought us to these dialogues about race.
Well, and again, I think we were both coming in intentionally wanting to talk about what the issues might be between us. As Jean is going to tell you in a little bit, it was sort of obvious that we had organizations that had similar missions and goals. So she's going to be talking about that very soon. But basically, we needed to discuss what it was like to work together, where we were coming from, and some of the history, really. There's a lot of history from the suffrage movement on through the League movement that really needed to be sorted out and hashed out and have people understand.
What we were looking at is how a organization of women of color can partner in an inclusive way with a predominantly white organization, historically and present, the League of Women Voters. So that's really what began the dialogue about some important issues to talk about relative to race. And I do want to make mention that Celia Blue, who Patty met, is the president of Massachusetts Women of Color Coalition. Okay, so as Patty said, typically when organizations get together, they look at their vision and mission and values and so forth and find common goals, which we did. And I'm going to run through some of those so you can see for yourself, hearing both, that there are common themes. So MAWOCC's vision is a commonwealth that is authentic and inclusive, where racism and sexism no longer dictate the outcomes of women of color and our communities. And our mission really is to be dedicated to enhancing the racial inequities among women of color that are created by structural, institutional, and interpersonal and internalized racism, and to address those racial inequities through authentic inclusion in the areas of political and civic leadership, education, justice, economic power, and sustainability, and criminal justice reform and healthcare reform at this point, and wellness. And the League had some similar mission and core values. The League is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informal and active participation in voting and citizens being involved in government, and works to increase the understanding of major public policy issues and influences policy through education and advocacy. Some of the visions and beliefs and core values of the League are to achieve solutions in public interest and key community issues at all government levels, build citizenship, participation in the democratic process, help communities in promoting positive solutions to public policy issues through education and advocacy, respect for individuals' diversity, empowerment of grassroots, both within the League and in the community, and operating in an open and effective manner to meet the needs of those we serve, both members and the public. So you can see that there are similarities, which is what we initially thought would help bring us to forming some kind of partnership and mutual events, if you will. We weren't really sure where we were going to go with that, but we thought that would be enough to connect us. And when thinking of how organizations get together, that often is. But then, as Patty mentioned, the interface of race really got in the way of partnering in a meaningful way that can be sustained, and that we can engage in projects that are going to be effective for both the League, but more importantly, from our perspective, effective for women of color in meeting our missions and goals. So there are really two key critical areas that I think are important to women of color of what the League does. And one is getting out the vote. The other is helping people become more informed voters and knowing how to use their voice to understand the issues and address issues for people of color in the communities of color. And MAWOCC has specific goals around that. We, under our political leadership and civic leadership goals, we are trying to increase not only the participation of women of color, but on a entry level as part of the community as voters, also to get women of color in leadership positions across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, both in state and local government. So part of doing that is getting out the vote, and another part of doing that is creating informed voters and addressing issues, creating platforms to bring forward and address issues that are important to women of color, us communities of color.
Thank you.
So there are ways we can connect. So why have these dialogues? Why do we still need to talk about race? Why is that important? And how do we get to connect ways that we have similarities in ways that we can work together when there are other things getting in the way?
So should I? Okay. So one of the things we thought we would reference today, not to do a kind of a book review, but basically one of the books that I've run across and a lot of us have talked about is White Fragility, written by Robin DiAngelo, and her subtitle is very much the point, which is why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism. So I just wanted to highlight a little bit, because my experience in reading it was a kind of a aha moment at the beginning when she started to talk about the good-bad binary. She sees this as some of the reason why white people have so much difficulty with talking about racism, because many of us were really raised at a time. Sorry, we're adjusting our camera here. Some of us were raised at a time when, like, I remember being a little girl when the stuff was going on in the 60s, was on TV, and it was very clear that the racists were bad. I mean, you were pictures of them doing terrible things for people during the protests and all that sort of stuff. And she talks about that we have a whole generation of people now that are mature baby boomers kind of thing, and they grew up knowing that, so they knew what was good and what was bad, so they think they're supposed to not have a bias or anything. So it's very hard for them to even broach the subject or admit that it's still a problem, especially if you're pretty protected from a lot of this thing. And when I read that explanation, it really made a lot of sense to me. And she writes beautifully and I think very clearly about how important it is to get past that barrier, sort of like you can't face it or something. And then there's one chapter that I think is particularly relevant for this group, which is, she calls it white women's tears, but it's a particular manifestation of white fragility, where you get these situations where you're maybe even a mixed group with white people and people of color, and some white woman will get terribly upset about something and totally distract everything and center it all on her. And it gets everybody kind of worked up. Men respond a certain way, women respond a different way. And she really talks about how important it is to be sensitive to your effect on people. And she even brings up the example of Emmett Till, which is someone who basically was brutally horrible. I mean, it's about the worst thing I've ever read. Murdered because a white woman was uncomfortable, and in fact she lied and the kid was killed, and she admitted that apparently on her deathbed. But she brings up that example in the book to make it just very clear that this is very loaded business, and white women need to be more responsible about their emotional expression when they're in groups with people of color.
Well, that's ironic because very often with women of color, this in a different way, emotions are brought up, and rather than freely expressing your emotions in terms of a sympathy, it's the opposite. Expressing your emotions presents you in a bad light. And, often from my personal experience, people say, oh, you're getting too emotional, you're taking things too seriously. And, well, discussing race is emotional. Mm-hmm. And the issues in this country around race are emotional. So when people talk about emotions related to race or act in an emotional way, as people of color, that tends to be a negative thing, where people tell you to stop it, get over yourself. Don't act so angry. That's one emotion. The other emotion is, oh, don't feel sorry for yourself. Oh, the other emotion is, why are you grieving or holding on to something that happened a long time ago? I mean, it's really difficult for Black and brown women to not feel traumatized, because trauma assails us from many directions. And so what do you do with that as you're interfacing with white America, and you have this whole load of baggage that you're carrying around, and it's being dismissed. Or you're being told there's no room to be emotional, there's no room to have feelings, and it becomes a difficult place. Whereas you're saying in the Angela book, it's brought up in a different way, that emotions are used to actually empower white women, because when people get caught up in emotions, it blocks really the issue that they're reacting to, which is being accused of being racist, or within the context of a racist society. So I don't know if you wanted to say more about D'Angela's book, but
Well, she also does describe typical, not necessarily every white man, but the way men defend themselves differently than women do when the white fragility is at play. But I don't think that's as relevant to this group. It does remind me, though, what you're saying of some of the stuff we read with Bell Hooks in terms of the how terrible it is to be sort of invisible all the time. And white, and she really did a lot to write about women, Black women suffering, and really bring it to light more. And that's part of the trauma of it, is that it's been not acknowledged and recognized
I
by
wanted
other
to.
people.
This is a good point to tell a little example of what happened. I think there was what happens when emotions are involved. And there's an example given by this woman whose name is Ruby Hammond. And she was an Aboriginal human rights activist in Australia. And there was a forum held last year, I think it was in 2018 in Sydney. And it was a group of women writers, and it's an annual writers festival. And the whole idea of the forum was to bring women of color and white women together, all within the context of writers from the media and writers of novels and so forth, together just to talk, just like we're talking about the issues of race. And there was a woman of color who expressed that women of color are getting louder and more influential, and that it's a testament less to the accommodations that we're making by the dominant white culture, but more to their own grit in a society that implicitly and sometimes explicitly wants them to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And she was really speaking out about advocating for women of color and encouraging women of color to advocate for themselves. And there was a woman in the audience that was white that really took issue with that. And her comments were more that it breaks down relationships and partnerships if women of color speak out what they're really thinking, what they're really feeling, and if that part of that includes how they feel they've been treated, regardless to race.
Mm-hmm.
And she went on, you could look it up online, but she goes on this tirade about how the Black women should behave if they want to form allies and partnerships with white women, which is speaking, but it's speaking to the issue that you brought up, and another one that you're going to get into, I think, it's speaking to the issue of white tears, that here you're allowed to grieve and feel bad that you're being accused of being racist, where the other side of it is, if someone's speaking out against racism, that's immediately seen.
You have to behave.
Well, you have to behave, but it's immediately seen as a negative emotion that you're expressing, and it can be seen as anger and a lot of things. So I wanted to use that example because that was a real example of, here was a forum where women came together to talk about race, and it broke down immediately because of that whole fragility and tears and, oh, how could you talk to me this way? How can you accuse me of certain things? I'm really a good person. So it broke down, the point of that story is that it broke down that dialogue and that communication that was supposed to take place at that forum, because the talk then became about how this woman felt she was being treated.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a point that someone
Wants
wants to ask a question or make a comment?
Is there anything in the chat room we should be paying attention to?
No, not right now. We just have a couple of people who have joined us. Welcome, Linda, who is a member of the Eastern region, and welcome Igina, who lives in Boston. So we just have folks joining us now, and Celia, who's the president of MAWOCC, has also joined us, and she says hello.
Hello,
Hi, Celia, and everyone else. I didn't hear all the names.
Gloria Legbold is
Oh, hi.
watching.
Hi, Gloria. She's from the league. Yeah. Well, we got some folks.
So I think this opens up a good conversation around what happens, when that happens in the partnership, in conversations where you're trying to bring two organizations together. How does that impact, right? And sort of thinking about what are the ways in which we ensure that we create those sort of agreements and partnerships that when we talk about race or when we talk about sensitive issues, that we make sure that we're centering the right individuals, the right community, the right topics, so that we are focused on what the end goal needs to be, and we don't become distracted by some of these other things that happen, like white tears.
Well put.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think it's a little more important than just focusing on the commonalities that you mentioned, Choma. I don't remember exactly what you said, but what Patty and I started talking about was we have to talk about the interpersonal. We have to talk about the systemic things that, because they are in the way. We went through earlier the commonalities between our missions and our values and our core beliefs, and there's definitely ways to connect. But where it's difficult to connect is when you get to the intersectionality of all of our idiosyncrasies as people and as groups of people, and gender and race and where we come from, all the ways things intersect. When you're trying to, if we don't address all of those issues for each entities, then it becomes very difficult to form a commonality. And I'm sorry, one of the biggest things is the intersection of gender and race. And it becomes extremely difficult at times to talk about race in real ways because of the things Patty was talking about and I was talking about, white tears, emotions, and how emotions are perceived between white women and women of color, and who can have good emotions about race and who's allowed to feel bad about race. And I don't know what else to add to. It was a long conversation that we had before people just joined, so I was trying to summarize that for people. But we are trying to find ways to talk about the intersection of the issues of gender and the issues of race to get to coming up with ways we can work together to move forward the missions of each of our organizations.
Right. And what I remember pretty clearly before we started the Facebook Lives is that we really had come to an agreement about needing to acknowledge some past issues. We learned a lot, some of us didn't know much and learned a lot about issues in the suffragette movement and even more recently than that. And that there was kind of a process of that needs to be acknowledged, that there is a history that was more traumatic for some groups than others. And that needs to be acknowledged. You can't just sort of sweep that under the rug. And that's probably acknowledged and give time for the feeling and then do what you can to make it right, sort of repair the damage or whatever. And it's probably not a bad formula to use as specific issues come up, because everybody's got trauma in this world on some level, but it's very clear that women of color have suffered tremendously, and that needs to be acknowledged.
So what are the ways in which you think we've done it to talk about race? We've done this Facebook Live, but what are some of the other ways you think that we've engaged in as individuals and as organizations that have this conversation around the intersection of race and gender? Also, I frame it framing it within an oppression lens, racism and sexism.
Is that a question that we're getting?
That's a question I'm asking.
Can you repeat it? It was a long question. I'll try to break it apart.
What are the ways in which you think we have, MAWOCC, the League of Winchester, have engaged in this conversation around race and the intersections of race and gender? What are the ways in which we've done it over the past several months?
The ways, well, I think having these dialogues and is the way we've done it. If I'm understanding your question right, and through these dialogues, I think it's not having an authentic dialogue is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that has to be part of your strategy, is to be as honest as possible and authentic, and to get information. And there's been a lot of information sharing about historic issues of racism, some very familiar to women of color, and others not as familiar to either group. And part of it is digging into the history, but you have to look for it. It's not something that you're going to learn in U.S. History 101, you know.
Yeah.
And so doing research is another way, but getting to know each other. I mean, this group, since I've been part of it, probably since last January, this group has spent time in a collective group, but also individuals getting to know each other, asking questions and exploring. But you have to be very honest. I'll just be frank. You gotta not be afraid to say race. You gotta not be afraid to say racism. You have to not be afraid to say racist systems. And you have to start to work together to talk about what those words mean. And they're gonna, as Patty and I have struggled a little bit through this presentation today, they're not easily defined, and it means different things to the different groups respectively. White America and America of color. And we have to be willing to really explore and dive into information, like I said, interpersonally, systems, historically. And I don't know if you have anything to add. When I start to get compassionate about something, I talk. So, did that answer your question, Chioma?
Well, and I'd like to add a little bit, because I think what happened for me earlier on, even in the large conference calls, that we had a few large conference calls with several people on the phone, there was a misunderstanding or something that took place that involved race and gender. And one of the lessons I took away from that, and some real bravery from people who authentically brought it up and listened and tried to talk through what was going on, the idea that it's not just, women of color have one experience and white women have another one, but everybody within each group comes from a unique position as well. So that we might have, like Jeanette and I might have a very different reaction to something, and that within the Women of Color Coalition group.
I don't think they know Jeanette's white.
Oh, all right. Well, we did say she was from the League of Women in Winchester,
Okay,
so statistically speaking.
So by default.
But Jeanette is white. But anyway, but in fact, that uniqueness is why the authenticity is so important, because you've got to just be yourself, be honest, as honest you can be, and kind of own who you are and what your background is. And so every single person has a different take on things, so people can take it very differently when things happen, and it kind of needs to be talked out, needs to be hashed out. And in some cases it can be quite traumatic, especially if there's been a long history of being misunderstood or whatever.
Well, it can be very traumatic for women of color, and also for white women, as you talked about earlier with the tears, white women's tears. It's traumatic because women or no one really wants to be accused of being racist, and because people would associate that with, it's an ugly word, and I'm a bad person if that's who you're saying I am, and there aren't any good things associated with that. So it is up to individual, but I have to tell you honestly that for women of color there is a danger also in bringing forward issues of race. And the danger is how you're going to be perceived. And when that affects you in the workplace, or that affects where you're going to buy a home, or that affects you just going shopping. So there's a real danger there of talking about issues of race with white women and really wanting to speak what's on our mind, And because part of it is wondering, well, what's going to happen if I tell the truth
Yeah.
of how I really feel? And we discussed earlier, things happen like dismissiveness. Things happen like defensiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Someone feels they have to defend themselves against something you said.
Did you have a?
We have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to expand on something that was said, and Angelina Camacho, who's actually out of the Eastern region, highlighted. She said, absolutely, you're right, not in History 101. So the comment you were saying about how do we learn and keep learning, and you won't learn this until your History 101 classes. So maybe this will be a great opportunity to share what are some of the resources that you all have used to learn more about this topic, and particularly like what we've been sharing with each other via email in terms of the learnings. The last Facebook live event we did, we talked about Bell Hook's book, and that was I think a shared journey amongst all of us where we all took the opportunity to read. Are there any other? What are the other resources that we've shared amongst ourselves that people can take advantage
just
of?
the thing is, there is a book. This is the summary notes for it, but Patty's book.
Like that? There we
Yeah.
go.
It's good. It'll show.
Want to
it'll show
read
up.
what the title is?
Anyway, this is the one that I mentioned by Robin DiAngelo, and the title is White Fragility, and the subtitle is Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. So,
And one of the references I've been using is Kimberly Crenshaw, who was the first person really to coin the term. I'm sorry, I'm not used to being on camera. Coin the term intersectionality. And she is a professor at law at UCLA in California. And she's a leading authority in the area of civil rights, Black feminism, and legal therapy, a strong advocate for anti-racism work. And she also has had articles that appear in the Harvard Law Review, the National Black Law Journal, Stanford Law Journal. This woman's very accomplished.
Yeah.
She's something else. She's behind the Black Girls Matter movement and another. You can look all these things up online. She has a TED Talk on why we can't wait, talking about intersectionality and the importance of recognizing the intersection of race and gender when it comes to talking about issues of feminism, because women of color, if not seen with issues specific to our needs, can just get what she calls, you can just get lost in the stream, floating down the river when issues of feminism are raised that are mostly mainstream, and hoping that all women might have the same issues. For example, healthcare. When you think of healthcare, there starts to be specific things that people care about. The cost of healthcare, are you getting the right healthcare for all ages of women, and so on and so on. But with general categories and not recognizing and looking at specific needs of women of color because of historic and current issues of racism, because of systemic racism, because there are issues that are very specific to communities of color, because they're not part of mainstream and the same access to the same systems, and there are problems with equality, problems with injustice, and so forth. So if people are understanding what I'm saying, that under the issues that might fall under a category of women's issues that feminists bring forward, there are sub-issues that not necessarily connected to gender, but are connected to gender for women of color because they are issues connected to race. So these things always have to intersect and be looked at if you're going to have inclusive programs. Kimberly Crenshaw talks a lot about that intersectionality and the importance that we start to look at women of color and being more inclusive with policies around gender and activism around feminism. Watch her TED Talk.
Yeah, she has actually a lot of TED Talks that are excellent.
But that one is a really good one. And again, it's called Why We Cannot Wait.
So Brenda Jenkins commented, in the culture we are in today, white women need to take on their own responsibility on privilege and power and how it impacts women of color today.
Absolutely. And that's the reason that Patty started talking about a couple of the issues that are in the book by
Robin DiAngelo.
Robin DiAngelo. And one of the issues that white women need to look at is the whole white fragility. But this book is loaded with other issues that white women need to pay attention to. And one of the other ones in chapter 5, Patty, I think that you were going to talk about is, give us a second here. I asked Patty to talk about it. She wasn't necessarily keen on it. So then I should find it because I think it's a really important one. And that is the good and the bad.
The binary, yeah.
The binary issue. This is a big one. Can I start it off?
Sure.
The binary issue is a really big one that DiAngelo talks about. And that is something that we did touch on a little bit. That is, if you want to carry on.
Well, I've got a list of quotes about it from here that we can maybe read a couple of those pithy ones, because she explains that because it was sort of set up as in our childhoods, we sort of perceived this as a good bad binary, that we're sort of left with that value statement on it. But basically she says the good bad binary is a false dichotomy. All people hold prejudices, especially across racial lines, in a society deeply divided by race. The simplistic idea that racism is limited to individual intentional acts committed by unkind people is at the root of virtually all white defensiveness on this topic. To move beyond defensiveness, we have to let go of this common belief. And, you know, it's amazing how still a lot of folks I know will go back to this, that person's did a racist act or they're a racist, rather than looking at the systemic causes that are what are really causing the big problem these days for most of us.
Let me break it down a little more real. Before the Civil Rights Act, racism in the country was a problem for white Southern bad people that were immoral. It was seen that way.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about with binary. So the conversation begins, not me, only these certain people that behave certain ways. And as Patty says, that just isn't true. Post-civil rights movement, it becomes more people to the extreme, the white supremacists and people that are openly hateful. Excuse me?
I said, and then we move into sort of the meaning of the Confederate flag.
The meaning of
even in today, modern day, people think the Confederate flag is patriarchal, but also represents racism.
But that's an important thing is, well, they lost the war, but we do allow, we're not flying Japan's flag. We do allow in this country, it's a great example, Chioma. We do allow in this country for people to wear the badge in honor of a Confederate flag. What? I mean, that's not America. It was a war that was fought in America. But that's exactly what we mean. It's dismissed. It's not, we can't even have the conversation of the pain and the absurdity that goes along with people driving around with a flag for a war that was a serious war. And I think most lives in any war in American history were lost in that war. So we fought for something, but then again, it's because it's those people that do it.
Yeah.
It's
Rather
not
than
seen,
recognizing how we're
Right.
colluding in something every day that creates
but
a
it
system
it
that's harming people.
it interrupts the conversation that I think between our two groups we've done a good job at pushing past. I think it interrupts the conversation. What the real issue is on the table is that there is a problem with race. To say that is important, and to recognize that is important, because when we start there, nobody's being accused of being a horrible person. We gotta put those emotions on the table, deal with them, and move on. To start there means then we can be really honest and truthful to get to the real work that we might want to do as two organizations that partner together. And there are ways that we need each other. We talked about it. Getting out the vote. It's important. But we want to be included in where, how, and when the vote gets out, and teaching people about issues. We want to be included and want issues included for people of color because they're important.
Yeah.
And to me, if we could dialogue about these issues openly and honestly, and we can look at each other and say the word race, and say the word white, and say the word black, and brown, and all of those, and talk about really significant, real things that impact each other without saying you're a bad person, without your saying, oh, don't be so angry and sensitive. If we can get to really be truthful about this dialogue and know that race is part of making decisions. It's going to be part of it in America. And that we being open and honest about it, that's when we can decide possibly we can do some partnership in what we could do. But only when we move beyond the exclusion of not being able to have that voice and be heard. Yes.
So I appreciate that that point that you're making, because I think it's critical as we talk about partnerships. Often when we talk about partnerships, we go immediately to, okay, what can we do together?
Yeah.
And so we're moving together, but we're speaking two different languages. When you say we have to break down systems, and I say we have to break down systems, they can be two totally different things. But we're moving in a direction with this sort of end goal, in quotes, but we're really not talking about the same thing, right? And so that's why I appreciate what you said and appreciate this process that both organizations have committed to, because now we're in dialogue and we're saying, oh, that's what you mean? Oh, but you need to look at it this way. Oh, I get your point. Yeah, I agree with that. I didn't think about it that way, right? And that allows us then, when we start talking about sort of those strategies to partner on, or that work to partner on, we know we're in sync, we know we're aligned, we know we're talking about the same thing. So it's important for me to put that out there, because I think too often, especially in doing this work, I do racial justice work in other spaces, and too often it's about what is the solution, what is the end goal. And it's not about, okay, let's dialogue and let's process to make sure we're all on the same page. Because if you're talking about one thing and I'm out in the street and I'm about to get arrested and you walking in the other direction, obviously we weren't on the same point, because you're supposed to be getting arrested with me, right? And so, you know, I value all of you that have been a part of this dialogue. I value everybody who's joined us on Facebook Live, because this is an opportunity for us to be clear about the direction that we're going. So in saying that, I do want, you want to say something?
I don't want to lose it, but one thing that's important about what you said, we want to get on the same page and make sure we understand each other. But I want to be real clear. It doesn't mean we have to agree.
Right.
Because the process, if we agree on what we think we might want to do together, the process how we're going to get there is going to be even another layer. So I feel like the most important part to me, I don't know how you feel about this, Patty, but the most important part to me has been able to have the dialogue, period. It's not so much with the end of the dialogue, which is what I think in part Chioma was saying. It's not so much the end, it's taking the walk to get there. But I also don't want to lose sight of a very important thing, and that is what we said at the very beginning of this about our missions, our 2 mission statements, and our core values and our beliefs and some of our goals, is that after this big circle around, we still need to circle back to the importance of how we can make connections. I mean, that's why we started the conversation in the first place. So that end means that Chioma was talking about, we tend to jump to and want to get something done. All this work is circling back to that original of, can we do something together? Is there commonality between two very different organizations in that we can help each other by helping our community? And I think that's the most important and valuable part of this, is we're going through this circle so that we can get back to that. And if the answer is we can't work together, then we'll realize that through this process. But we started out, I don't want people to lose sight of this. We started out with things that are of value and importance to both organizations, maybe for different reasons, but that's really important. Otherwise, why are we having the conversation at all?
So we have about 12 minutes left, and I want to get to a question that Linda Hudson asked. And so she said, we know that oppressive systems are the source of the isms impacting women of color and poor women. Are there strategies you recommend for groups like yours on partnering to deconstruct these systems? That's the big question, Linda. And I want to give Jeanette some space because she has some thoughts around that.
Well, Linda mentioned health and housing, for example. And it's a huge question, because these systems, deconstructing just each one of those systems in terms of, you know, what women of color and white women feminists want, and what the commonalities are. And the first thing that I thought of in terms of healthcare is, you know, back in the 60s, white feminists were very much about fighting for birth control, control over their bodies. Maybe there were other issues for women of color that, you know, did not get addressed. Housing, you know, big push for private ownership as part of the American dream. Well, predatory lending practices left out, you know, African Americans from achieving those dreams. Public housing and the scourge on that, you know, funneling people into public housing, you get classism, race, the intersection of classism, racism. So those are two huge systems that.
So the question was, I think, what we could do to break down the barriers created by those systems?
Yeah, so the question is, what are some recommendations for groups who are partnering, like our two groups, to start deconstructing oppressive systems? And I think Jeanette was bringing up a very good point in terms of giving examples on ways systems have oppressed.
Right.
And the different views in terms of not just white women, but white communities have around one, and how that has impacted not just women of color, but communities of color. So those two views on is said will work, but it actually only works for one group.
So,
did you want to add something else, Jeanette?
Well, I think there are a lot of assumptions made, you know, in the the overall fight for equality. And I think we've been talking about that. You have to break down what's meaningful for each group, and where does that intersection happen, so that we can work together to achieve those goals, so that everyone's lifted up.
Right, but I also think there's separate work to do. I think Brenda mentioned a comment about work. About what was her comment exactly?
About white women need to do the work.
Right, white women needing to do work, and it's really important. I mean, we've had forums to have voices for a long time, and we have, as women of color, we have had voices for a long time. And sometimes it gets really hard to share those stories if they're going to fly out the window, or if there's not support for the stories. Sometimes it's difficult whether or not your stories are believable or really understood, I think, is It's both. And so, and part of that is we have the experience and you don't, because we live it every day. And with the issues that were brought up earlier about defensiveness, you know, in the white tears, not wanting to be seen as a bad person, and internalizing, making it all about you, all those things have blocked from, I think, ears from really hearing us and what we're saying. And it's been a long time. What's that song? A long time coming. Things gonna change. Things gonna. Aretha Franklin sings it. So it's been a long, long time. And I think things are moving on the change with organizations like yours and ours being brave enough to do this work. So there is, I think the question I would put it to both of you, from all this talk, what have you heard is some of the work that you think white women can do within their organizations?
Well, I think we're seeing that in our community, right, Patty?
Mhm.
We're seeing that in Winchester in the faith houses of worship, with, you know, groups really exploring and talking about and acknowledging racism, learning the history, reading the books, really, you know, educating themselves and, you know, starting on the individual level, because you have to start from within to then
Right.
be able to, you know, work outside to change. And so I see that happening in my faith organization or house of worship. And I know that, you know, Patty also involved. See that happening in our community with our formerly Winchester multicultural network, now Network for Social Change. So over the past 20 years, I've seen a lot more awareness, a lot more self-reflection, learning, acknowledgement. But the question still remains, what are the actual strategies, hardcore actions that we can do to affect change?
Right. Do you see and we're back to on the organizational level. I can appreciate that. You're absolutely right, Jeanette, that it's important to do the work as an individual, and it's hard work, and you have to be committed to it. You have to be brave, you have to be willing, you have to be honest, all those things. But then your statement that you just made is, then how does that transfer to systems? And so when you look inside of the organization is, okay, I'm changed or I'm changing. How do I do it? Do I influence others that look like me and that have the privileges and the life that I've had? Do I encourage them to change? Does the organization need to change its structure? Are you going to do business the same way? Different business the same way? Or are you going to have a new way of a new business? Or what's it going to be? I mean, there's work that has to be done. And I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Well, I'm back stuck on the fact that, so maybe this will help to sort of bring it around a little bit, but that both groups are really interested in getting out the vote, but we may have a very different idea about that. I mean, that's sort of the main thing the league does, and educates voters, but we may have very different ideas about it. But maybe that's the specific kind of work we should be looking at and comparing notes about. What do we mean by that? What do you mean by that? What could we do? Because it's certainly timely in the next year to be getting out the vote. So I'm just to take it down to something specific, because it's one thing for us to go to our local high school and register kids to vote in the cafeteria one day while they're at school. That's something they do. It's our bread and butter on some level. But it would be a very different experience, and I think it's worth trying of us to sort of get out and get to some communities that make sense to be canvassing, or I've done a little bit of that, but it's been a while.
Right,
So,
but in this,
but I don't know what does that mean? What would your version of it be?
we don't.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we're here talking, and that's why I said, going back to the beginning, some things that we could do together. Now we're at the point that we could talk about how would it make sense? How might we do something like that with the league? Would we use the process that you normally use? I mean, that's a great question for you to ask us, and that's how the inclusive partnership would work, is how would you get out the vote in a community of color?
Yeah.
This is the materials we have, this is how we do it. Are you willing to change if that's what it takes and that's what's necessary to really get out there in an authentic way that we know we're going to bring people to the table who haven't voted, who have challenges of immigration and afraid to come forward, who might not know their rights after incarceration, who are people that, just like you, working, supporting their families, but feel their taxpayer dollars are not working for them because things that they need are not necessarily being addressed. I mean, there's so many topics and so many things to talk about when you go back to the common goal of getting out voter registration, and getting people to then that are registered to actually come out and vote. So
I want to acknowledge that we got 2 more minutes.
Oh, wow.
And I want to use
Fast.
those 2 minutes to prepare us for our part 4, right? So we have a part 4 that's happening. What month is this? October, November. When do we do part 4?
December. Should we do it early January instead? Or
That's far.
would be
Well,
December. But
Yeah, so December or
Can I mention this?
January.
You know what the topic's gonna be already?
yeah, that's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, give me, yeah.
Okay.
So for part 4 is happening December, January. We don't really know, okay? But we will keep everybody informed. But part 4 is really getting to this and now what conversation. And I think some more questions have already come up around the and now what. The question that Linda posed about sort of strategies that partnerships like ours can think about to destruct systems. Celia just asked a question about sort of what are the ways in which the League Winchester is implementing to sort of affect change at the local level. I think even within MAWOCC Eastern Region, we can ask that question, right? What are some of the ways in which we're taking this conversation and processing it and thinking about what our own internal practices from the local to the state level, and what does that mean in terms of partnership? So I think there's questions that both organizations can need to sort of figure out and then come back together. So I want to say, Angelina said we said before December. Obviously we all don't know what it's gonna be, but we'll figure it out. But I want to say, give our organizations action steps, right? And for us to think about these actions. I'm saying this for all of us to do to think about that. So let's offer up action steps as a collective, right? So my action step to both organizations will be to, my recommendation as an action step is to have internal conversations answering the question, and now what, for our organization. That's my action step. That each organization would now go have internal conversations and answer the question, and now what? This is in prep for our part 4 meeting, Facebook Live. Does anybody else have any next steps, action steps, charges for each?
I think just part of that is continue this open dialogue to get to those next steps. And we wanted to really end on asking viewers and ourselves and our working group, to brainstorm about ways that we think we might be able to partner together based on where we started with our mission and values, but not just the list of ways or activities, because we don't want to do what Chioma said at the beginning we didn't want to do, but list things that we know we can really talk about and be open of what's going to work, given the systems that we've all been talking about that are at play for us and the challenges that we have in dealing with those.
So it sounds like 2 action steps. Anybody else?
Again, the continuation of dialogue is so crucial to these issues. really is.
Can I repeat that? So our guest is saying she thinks that the continuation of dialogue is so critical to these issues.
In bringing the two groups together.
And also in bringing the two groups together, right?
There is a commonality in between the two groups in terms of getting the vote out and working at developing an increased number of informed voters.
So she sees a commonality for both groups in terms of getting the vote out and getting increased number of informed voters.
That's important.
Yeah.
And there's going to need to be more grassroots work in terms of approaching religious organizations, the civic organizations, and social groups within our communities.
So there's more grassroots needed in terms of approaching various groups within our communities. Is that?
Our work is very challenging. Both of these organizations is
Very
really
challenging work.
very challenging in terms of getting folks to see that the vote is the most powerful tool we have.
It's very challenging to get folks to see that the vote is the most powerful tool we have. So one of my questions was, if you're talking about deconstructing systems, we're not talking about deconstructing the voting system, or are we? I mean, again, I'm just throwing that out because that means different things to different people, right?
And maybe we are.
But
I mean,
certainly a League of Women Voters value that the vote is a very important part of our system and informing the voters. That's certainly compatible with the League of Women Voters. But
And
that
so-
doesn't mean everybody has that opinion.
It's the platform of a true democracy.
yes.
Exactly.
We must have a democracy that represents all of the people. You know, and it's not happening.
So she's saying that's the characteristic of a true democracy. We need a system that represents all of the people. Okay. Is that a good note to stop on? Have we gone over time? Can't see.
What? Oh, yep. 5:04.
Okay, well, I certainly want to thank everybody.
And
Jean has
I
invited us down here to this lovely location. It's been wonderful. And then Chioma's here, and we're very happy to have Maddie Riggin here. And thank you, Jeanette. It's the first time you've been directly involved, but it's great to have you. So thank you.
Patty's
everybody.
giving me credit for inviting them down to Cape Cod, but it's not scenic Cape Cod today because it's raining and cold. But it was a pleasure to be here. I'm so grateful that they came and traveled here. And thank you all for listening. Watch for more comments on our page.
So
Thank
and
you.
we'll be back in December, it looks like.
Bye.
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 Video. All right, I'm gonna push that button. Bye-bye.
Does it stop?
I think this will stop it when I push this button.